New Zealand Tech Podcast, the voice of the tech community. Proudly supported by Umbrella Connect.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. We are at episode 529. This is part 3 of our 10-year anniversary episode. We can't probably call it an episode because it's 3 episodes, but this is the part where we're going to delve into really the future of technology, particularly with a New Zealand bent. So very pleased to welcome back to the show Sarah Putt. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello and welcome. Oh, well, and thank you for welcoming me. And I'm very excited again to be on the 10th anniversary triple show.
And you are representing?
I'm with CIO and Computer World.
Thank you. Great to have you here. And Bill Bennett, back again.
Yes, always good to be here, Paul. And I represent myself. And when it comes to the Christmas Carol edition, I'm the ghost of Christmas present.
We are going to... We've had 2 episodes already focusing on the past, the present, and now it's time to delve into the future a little bit. And this is an area where I love to be. I don't know when it was that I sort of started, trying to figure out where we would be in the future. But it's been with me for a long time, and so I enjoy having these discussions and delving in. And I guess when I'm doing public speaking and keynotes and so on, I'm often asked to speak from that futurist perspective. And my sort of simple view on it is that we all need to be futurists. We all need to wear this hat of being, strategic and forward-looking. And, for New Zealand to be a success, for our organisations to be a success, we can't get, just completely caught up in the here and now, but we've got to be looking out ahead. So this episode is about a little bit of that. Now, we can't cover everything, and we certainly don't actually know what the future is going to hold, but we can look at some of the indicators and delve in a little bit. Now, first up, we have a question that I think I'm kind of curious to hear your viewpoints on, and this is to do with what is and isn't a tech company. And we've heard, I guess, over a number of years from all sorts of businesses that they are now tech companies. ASB said, we're a tech company. We just happen to deal with, money and banking and so on. And there are varying variations on this. I remember speaking to the CEO at Ford in the US. His variant was we are a mobility company, but it was all about the sort of, tech and so on, enabling them to change from being an automobile company. And at that stage, they were dealing with e-bikes that they were trying out. They were looking at multi-mode transport. You could very much see that the threads of tech, of information technology and so on, were really running through what they were doing, and we've really seen this in lots and lots of different areas. So the question is, should every company be a tech company? What's your thoughts, Bill?
Well, the same question could apply to finance. Is every company a finance company? Because every company deals with finance. So, I think, look, I tend to think in terms of what I would call a pure tech company. Now, Apple is a pure tech company, and IBM would be a pure tech company.
Isn't Apple a marketing company?
Possibly, yeah, okay. But my point is there are companies that are pure tech companies. There's just unambiguous, right? Otherwise, it's applied tech, and it's like when you go back to high school. You have pure maths and applied maths. Pure maths is one thing, applied maths is another thing, and I think it's that distinction. So in the sense that, applied technology, sure, everyone's a tech company, but also it's a kind of fashion thing. I mean, tech came of age and it became ubiquitous, but when I started out in this game, reporting on it, it was a bit esoteric, a bit oddball, and a bit out there, and
geeky.
Yeah. Well, not so much geeky as just strange. And I fell into it because I had a science background, not a technology background. And they thought, we've got a reporter who can write about science. he can go and do the tech stuff for us as well. So I'm in two minds about it, but I think we do need to distinguish between pure tech and applied tech companies. But in the sense that you just mentioned, yeah, sure, we're all tech companies now.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So if you're a tech company like Apple, it's what you're selling, which is a tech-enabled device. It's a phone or it's a, whatever. If you're Ford, it's a car. So, it's however you apply. But the way I think about tech is it's about a state of mind. So you've got to think like a tech company, because what a tech company does when it is at its finest is at its best, and it's talking about the future and how things are going. So it's ideas like turning things around, thinking about it from a different direction. Think about how tech has changed just basic things, like how people think about CapEx and OpEx when they think about a SaaS program. Think about how you imagine tech, or how in terms of communication, it upends everything. Tech has upended every sector.
Yeah, and the one that gets me every time is when people tell me that Uber is a tech company. Well, no, Uber is a taxi firm which used the tech industry's venture capital model to get started. And so it's a taxi firm, but it has it's borrowed elements from the tech sector. But that's, of course it has, because
it's completely enabled by technology. Like, wouldn't have been possible without technology.
No, but neither would an airline.
But yeah, you're right. It's not a firm that's selling technology to the audience, but it leverages technology to basically be a disruptive force.
But I'm gonna say something here which I think a lot of people watching this or hearing this are not going to like, and it's this, right? It's fashionable to say we're a tech company, just as it's fashionable at the moment to say we're agile, right? Now, sure, those companies are using agile techniques and so on, but agile was something that was, originally started in the software business. It was a tech thing. It was a software industry thing, and it's an idea which has permeated out. It's moved out of the software space and has become a general idea throughout management. And I think in the same way that the attitudes of the tech sector have moved out of the tech sector and moved across all other businesses. But just because you're thinking like a tech person, just because you're running the show like it's a tech business, doesn't make an airline into a tech company. It makes it into a tech-enabled.
How you make your money. If it's taking passengers around, it is. Although, can I just say on the Uber thing, if you ask most people what they love the most in terms of the people who use the Uber service, it's the seamless payment. It's the fact that you just get out of the cab at the end, out of the car at the end.
So it's finance.
So, and possibly this could be reframed a little bit. And personally, I don't care, what we choose to call our organisations, whether they're businesses, non-profits, and whether we label that's a tech business or a tech non-profit. What I guess maybe what I was sort of thinking about is, with that question, should every company be a tech company? Is how important is tech in our future success? So how much do we need to be, whether we get labelled it or not, how much do we need to be leveraging what's possible with tech, some of the new ideas in terms of the ways that people work, whether it's an agile approach that's come through the tech sector. To me, it seems that those organisations that decide to sort of sit back and say, well, we're going to operate as we've operated for the past 10, 20, 30 years, those are the organisations that are not likely to have great success over the long term, whereas those who are open-minded to the possibilities that tech facilitates tend to be those that are going to be around on the longer term.
Yeah, I think you're generally right. But I was thinking, what's the flip side of this, right? What are there any companies out there which have zero technology? Well, there probably are, right? I mean, I can't name one, but I'm sure there will be proprietors and business owners say, I'm not having any of that stuff in my company. I'm not going near it. We'll still do things the old way. There will be some. Those people will probably die out. I mean, the fact that we don't ever hear of them speaks volumes.
Well, but even analog things like checks are harder and harder to do. I mean, everyone's being pushed.
You're forced to a degree, but it's where do you sit? Where do you sit on the on that continuum? I came across a firm recently that does some sort of metal type working with different metals and steels and so on. And I'd driven past this particular firm, and I thought, that's probably some old signage and so on. The sign, everything looked very old. And I was speaking to somebody who was saying, "Oh, this company's amazing. They built this trolley thing for me that did blah blah." And I was like, "Oh, that's really cool." But you might not actually find them online. Now they're able to survive because of word of mouth like this. That can still work. And they're really cheap and etc. So there were these different aspects that help keep them going. But if they were to start up that business today, that probably wouldn't work on the same sort of basis.
There are going to be some firms where being retro is their thing. Yeah. Right. And that's their selling point. And the fact that they do choose to do nothing, nothing in the 21st century, perhaps nothing in the 20th century, is just their thing, and that's.
Well, you just think about how tech's completely changed entrepreneurship and enabled it for so many people, and all that ideas. You talk about agile, and what's that Eric Rie's book?
Lean Startup.
Lean Startup, and you talk about your MVPs and all, and your pivoting and all that kind of stuff. Well, you hear that language in other industries and other sectors now all the time, and that comes from tech. That comes from the tech industry.
It does. I mean, the previous model for management was largely from the military. Actually, I mean, it came out the Second World War and
chain of command, all that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's it's a paradigm.
And then we've got
he's going to be ecosystem.
Talking of acronyms, OKRs. Who's familiar with OKRs?
Which is really KPIs.
Well, no, it's
Depends.
different. So objectives and key results, and this is what came out of Intel and Andy Grove, and it's Google have heavily sort of taken this particular approach. But anyway, we're probably going a little bit off track. But I guess my point with this sort of starting thing is probably to sort of maybe look to see if either of you would support me in my view that for New Zealand to succeed and go forward, that we do need to be leveraging tech, more and more so. We need to be educated, and hence this podcast, the New Zealand Business Podcast. Yes. A lot of that is around educating and keeping us at the forefront on these things.
How you apply it is incredibly important, and whether you can apply it wisely or you can just chuck it out there.
Absolutely.
You can spend a lot of money going.
And that's where I think in New Zealand we probably bring a different viewpoint and a different flavour to how we think about technology. We're very creative people. We look at what's been done in the film industry, especially the gaming industry. We're starting to see that come through, and you sort of add in that Kiwi ingenuity, number 8 wire type bits and pieces. There are some aspects of that are good, some that aren't, and there are certainly some downsides to probably where we sit and distant in the world and some of our thinking, but I think in general it seems to work quite well, and I'm very, very hopeful that we will be able to facilitate a lot more of these sort of weightless exports, digital innovations coming out of New Zealand that we can export to the globe off the back of this mindset and a focus on leveraging the technology, using all of that thinking.
Yeah, and it's the pure tech company is that hockey stick growth idea, isn't it? That you put all the money into the R&D. Once you've created the product and use a minimum viable product, you get it out there, it starts to move. Yeah. You go down, but then you just incrementally make money. You
or
grow.
Incremental cost is almost zero.
The cost is almost zero. It's just sort of incremental improvement, but the revenue just takes off. That hockey stick growth, and that can be enabled by those independent software vendors. Software is really the key there.
But here's the thing: you mentioned the number 8 wire thing, and when I first came to New Zealand like 35 years ago, that term was used everywhere, particularly in the tech sector, because I came here to a job editing the tech pages of the newspaper, and everywhere I went, I heard that term. Today, we're not that distant, really. I mean, thanks to fibre, you're really not that distant from the rest of the world, and I think we're losing that distance thing quite quickly. I mean, we still have lots of stuff which is uniquely us, but I don't think that we're this sort of strange appendix down the end of the world anymore.
No, and part of the reason for that, as you said, is fibre. So that sort of really is a good sort of push for us to delve into a little bit our telecommunications sector, how important that is for us, and look, it underpins really our ability as a nation to be successful on the global stage. And I know we've talked about this a little bit on the last episode or two, but I guess I'm keen to look forward a little bit. So we're in this position. We've got the biggest telcos, Spark and Vodafone, who have been around for a long time. Vocus and 2 Degrees, sort of a step back from them. We have the fibre connectivity. I think, Bill, you were reminding us on the last episode, it's end of next year. I think that it's it's due to reach 87% of the population. We're well down the track on that. There are other things in terms of the rural broadband initiative to hit others, and then on top of that, landing actually not too far away this year. In fact, I signed up for it last night just because I like to try these things out. Is Starlink, which is Elon Musk and SpaceX's new satellite-based internet. So there's some interesting things going on in that field. Where would you expect our telecommunications to go over the next few years? Do the current models work?
Well, I think we're at a peak of some kind in the industry right now, and we're also at a kind of point of stability, which we have these rare moments of stability in the sector, and then it goes and gets shaken up, but usually because of new technologies come along or something, an external event of sorts. But we're kind of at a peak moment now. I mean, in terms of performance, our networks are as good as anywhere in the world. If you look at some tables that are drawn by overseas organisations, we're number one in various areas, but we're certainly top 10 in just about every department. And it's very important for us as a nation, particularly because of that distance thing, and not just because we are distant from the world, but we're distant from each other within the country as well. So I think we're at some kind of peak. If we were to draw a graph right now, this would possibly be, as I say, some kind of peak. Where's it all going? Well, the thing is it couldn't be more competitive than it is today. And there are arguments that it's too competitive, and that it's so competitive that there's not enough revenue being generated to invest in future technologies, because the margins are so small that investors are not going to stump up for $1 billion investment to build a new network when they can spend $1 billion on housing and make 25%.
It's an interesting point. Although we did see an announcement from Vodafone this week, albeit without numbers, but they're saying, look, we typically are spending hundreds of millions a year investing back into telecommunications infrastructure, and that's just Vodafone. And they're saying, hey, we're actually ramping it up.
And Spark's done a big rollout
at this time. And I mean that's just one example.
I think Chorus said it's going to spend 1 point something billion over the next 3 years.
They've just talked about that with the Commerce Commission and the latest round of and that's a good point. Obviously, we've got a new regulatory regime coming in. I mean, they've got to do it for the next year, and then it's apparently settled for the next 10 years as it, once the rules get in place. I think what I'd really like to see in 10 years' time, if I look ahead to 2031, I'd like to not even think about telco, like the way I don't even think about electricity. And I think we're getting to that point. It's just there. It's just turn it on, and it happens and it works. One of the things that I think is from an industry perspective, and we've talked about this, is what's going to happen to those third players. I mean, Vocus is going up for sale. Apparently, it's going to be listed. That's when we're going to see the value of that. And then, of course, 2 Degrees. I mean, that's got a big job ahead of it to kind of. Is it going to keep up with this 5G race? Does it need to? Yes, absolutely, because people expect that kind of data experience.
Yeah, and raising the finance for that is going to be tough.
It's going to be really tough, especially with Huawei out of the picture, because Huawei, really was the cheapest option.
And it's subsidised. It had vendor financing for 2 Degrees in the past.
Because it wanted to be in this country. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think for as long as I've been writing about telecommunications in New Zealand, people have said there's a coming wave of consolidation. And you know what? There's actually more players today than there has been in the last 15 years. And soon Sky will be entering the market, and that's another player. And it's
albeit at the retail end with Focus.
But
totally.
Yeah. So that, like I say, it's extremely competitive. I think the differentiator is going to be where the individual companies can add value. So the likes of Chorus and Enable and North Power and UFF, they will start to move into the background, because they're in effect the pipes and they're the infrastructure, and there's a utility model, which is how the Commerce Commission views that level of things. So above that sits the retail layer. And it's all about how you can differentiate and how you can add value. And, in some cases, the value that you've added is where the cheapest. And that's pretty much the model that they've all chased. They can't all chase that model forever. It means if they all do, then no one makes any money. So
everybody has to get a return on their investment, don't they? And with this coming wave, because it's not just SpaceX and Starlink that's going to be, up in the sky. Now they're starting at, I think it's maybe it was $160 to $180 a month here in New Zealand for their sort of uncapped service. Now that's going to be really good outside of the cities. Now I've signed up in the city just to try it out, but in general that's going to work well in those other locations. But if we put 5 or 10 years on this, and in fact I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I'm not sure how well he'd crunched the numbers, but his point was actually it doesn't cost that much. Why doesn't the government just buy a network of satellites in the sky? Now I can't see that would likely ever happen.
Well, Australia did that with the NBN.
In New Zealand. So, yes, sort of. Yeah. I mean, with a earlier generation of satellite tech. But I'm kind of curious, where will we be from that competitive aspect if the cost comes down, which with technology it always does, on satellite, and it's good enough for lots and lots of things. I don't know how good it'll ultimately get, but if you ended up as we have in the cities at the moment, where you've got that compete between fibre, which yes, it's the best, it's the best offering for getting connectivity to your home, it's the most reliable, it's the best performing, but now we've got 4G and 5G competing, and often very, very similar price points. In fact, in some cases the mobile network connectivity is lower cost than the fixed, and that's so they can win the market share. And then maybe we've got this dominant one or more global players also with their satellites up there. I mean, how would that impact things? Could we be in a position where you can get an incredible internet connection per head, $10-20 per person that covers
with satellite technology,
everything?
I think that
the technology is probably not quite there to do it as I'm thinking, but in terms of certainly getting to homes, we could be in that position a decade out, possibly.
I find that find that one very difficult. I cannot see how satellite technology could ever compete with fibre in terms of speeds and feeds and all the rest of it.
Of latency.
No, and latency, and you've got to also remember the applications. So if you're in the financial community, I mean, it's second, it's milliseconds. I mean, latency is so massively important. There's no way that I could see satellite ever competing with
Think
fibre.
about using Zoom or Google Docs if you've got
exactly.
a very slow. I mean, you've got a fast
Well,
connection.
the
but
difference with this new satellite, and I'm just sort of throwing this out there for discussion, because look, what we've got in terms of fibre is world class. As I say, you can't directly compete with it in terms of delivering a better product. Not at all. But the latency of it is there on a similar basis to ADSL or VDSL. You're talking 30 milliseconds.
Well, that's
the latency.
That's Auckland to Invercargill as well.
That we're hearing about, right? So that is actually takes the traditional satellite connectivity latency out of the picture. So I guess this is something that we could spend a lot of time sort of delving into it.
I think the big issue with fibre, though, is going to be unbundling in 10 years. It doesn't matter now. It's just not possible in a GPON network. But that's where the competition's going to lie if you can't continue to have a range of different providers out there.
That would be the politics of it. I actually suspect, going back to the satellite, mobile and so on, right? The thing is, 87% of people can get fibre. Fibre's the gold standard. But so and it's not expensive. I mean, it's cheaper than we used to pay for our dial-up connections.
Most. I mean, probably 80% of the population would go for it if it wasn't for those with mobile networks that are tempting people with offerings, and possibly in some cases they're not highlighting quite the differences, but for some people it's actually just fine to go on a mobile connection.
The performance isn't there, but that doesn't, as you say, that doesn't matter for a lot of people. The thing about the mobile networks, the 4G, and there will be 5G before too much longer in terms of rural fixed wireless. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's just not as brilliant. And so what that means is, it means that the people that are in the fibre areas and the fixed wireless areas are not going. None of those people are going to be left behind. The satellite means that even the other people aren't really going to be left behind. They're just going to have to pay a little bit more and get a slightly less brilliant service. But it's still way, way better than most of the world has at the moment. It's way, way better than we've had through all our history. It's everyone, in theory, everyone in New Zealand would be able to watch the Rugby World Cup uninterrupted through their broadband connection.
Hold on. Then we're starting to get into Wi-Fi, which is probably the piece which actually needs to be solved.
Connectivity in the home.
Even that is actually changing fast. We've got Wi-Fi 6 now. Next year there's Wi-Fi 7. Wi-Fi 6 is so much better than the.
Still not ubiquitous in the in the short term. That'll take some time, but over 10 years, because we're sort of looking out, right? We would have some pretty high expectations.
Put your TV on an Ethernet cable to the router. It's that easy.
Well, look, that might work for you and me, Bill, but for the general public, I think wireless. So
that was the big problem in lockdown.
But 10 years out. I think that's an issue that will be solved, right? We're not going to have the same sorts of challenges, but we are still in a position today where virtually any business that wants its people to be productive. If you've got fixed desks and so on, you don't say, it's all Wi-Fi. You're setting up new premises, you go and cable it because you want that reliability and you want the performance. But I'm certainly very hopeful that we'll see that one solved. Okay, we've got to keep moving. I want to look at blockchain. Now, this is a term that gets kicked around. We've talked about it. It's always sort of a mega trend topic. It's a futurist topic. But we're in this interesting point. We're actually a decade or so in now since Bitcoin appeared, or a bit over a decade now, probably 11, 12 years. So the cryptocurrency thing, we've had a whole podcast on it recently, delving into it for those that are really interested. But there is an element now where that is starting to, really gain a footing from an investment perspective. And Darcy Angaro, who does the New Zealand Everyday Investor podcast, he famously said that those that are investing should look at putting a part of their portfolio into cryptocurrencies. And I think 5% was kind of the if you had to pick a number out of the air sort of thing, and everybody would be different. I remember that number. Maybe that was an example of what he does personally. But that's that's still a very sort of edgy viewpoint from investment perspective. Possibly in part, again, as he's raised, that investment advisors can't make any money off this stuff at the moment, generally, right? So there's a general thing of, do this, do that. Yeah, buy property, of course, because we'll pass through and handle the mortgage piece or whatever. But there are people like Darcy who probably take a bit of a broader view and a little bit more futuristic in terms of their thinking. So. Now, Bill, before we started, you had some comments around regulation. So will that come to an end with it? Maybe cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin being banned. The other aspect is, I guess, the sort of the broader view on blockchain, and there's quite a bit of work going on here in New Zealand on building business around the blockchain. Yet we have yet to see those sort of magical businesses that are, you can't believe this company, and it's all based on blockchain. Most of those blockchain things that we hear about, it might sound sort of fascinating and yes, that could be the future,
or they're part of an enterprise rollout, or they're part of but we're yet to sort of see, wow, look, that's the new Uber, that's the new Google, or anything like that is heavily reliant on blockchain. So I'm still really curious whether that's whether we're actually going to hit that point.
Well, they're good at their hype, aren't they?
and look, there's an aspect to that where a lot of these companies have raised money through having their own cryptocurrency, and we've got that in New Zealand where a lot of business that's happening now was funded from a craze and an interest in cryptocurrencies a few years prior, and we're kind of in that phase again where there's a lot of excitement.
You're absolutely right. Like 2 or 3 years ago, it was very much in the consciousness. People were talking cryptocurrencies were the thing, people were creating their own and all that kind of stuff. But really, the poster child, the one is Bitcoin. But it's almost like you've got to go blockchain, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. Bitcoin's its own kind of category, really.
And it's a problem. It's not sustainable in terms of the energy that it's using. I know that it's debatable about how much energy it actually uses. I know there are different estimates. I saw one from Bloomberg, which is, not necessarily the last word in these things, which said that at the moment Bitcoin uses roughly the same amount of energy each year as Italy. That's not the same amount of electricity. That's the same amount as all of Italy's energy consumption. And Italy, I think, is the 7th biggest economy in the world, or something like that. So if it was an economy, it would be like the 7th biggest user of electricity. I don't know. The numbers may or may not be spurious. Even if it was half that number or a quarter of that number, it's still a huge amount of power. And yet here we are in a world where everyone's talking about being carbon neutral. Yeah. And there are people who make a big song and dance about how carbon neutral they are, who then invest in Bitcoin.
So bring all the mining to places like New Zealand, where we predominantly using renewable energy. That said, look, we've got a range of cryptocurrencies. Some of them are much more power efficient than others. So if that continues to be an issue, then I imagine that they will that's something that can be addressed. Although it's fair to say Bitcoin,
it's Italy at the moment, right? But it's projected to become the world's #1 consumer of electricity by some other year in the future. Now, as I say, that's there's a lot of leeway in that, but that's not the point. Is not whether Bloomberg's numbers or anyone else's numbers are correct. The point is you chews up a huge amount of resources, and it's probably more than it's worth to us as a the value of the resources it chews is probably more than the value of Bitcoin to us as a thing. So that's where I was coming from with that, and it may be not now, but at some point that will start to become something that's really great. Where, for heaven's sake, we're hearing everyone now talking about being carbon neutral and so on. It's #1 topic. Bitcoin can't exist in a vacuum without that,
But it is an unusual and special and kind of its own category. But blockchain is a different beast, really. I know they're based on the same thing, but blockchain and where it goes is to your point, Paul, was totally hyped. I mean, every so often, every 2 or 3 years, it's the next best thing. I mean, haven't we all sat in events going, okay, so how would you apply that and what does that look like? And it's never really gone anywhere, but I do think it's being used in a lot of different applications, like around supply chain and all those kinds of things, and I think that's where it's going to sit. I think that's the level of blockchain, making things more efficient, keeping things accountable, knowing where things are, those real basic questions which you need to in a more complex world, and when people, like a retailer, you don't just have a shop front, you don't just have a website, you sell through all these multiple channels. Something's got to keep up with that.
I think you're right, but the thing about blockchain is, as you say, is it's massive, it's hyped out of all proportion, and this, oddly enough, is an aspect of what we were talking about right at the start of this podcast when we were talking about how everything is tech now and how everyone uses the tech approach to things. Well, one of the things that tech has done throughout history is massively overhyped.
It's great at PR.
Yeah. So talking of overhyping, 10 years out, autonomous cars, yes or no, Sarah Putt, in New Zealand, would you expect there to be an autonomous vehicle that you could jump into? Now, I'm asking this question because last night Greg from my team decided to drive to Wellington through the night. And I was quite worried about him. I, called him very late. Are you still awake? What's happening, and etc. Would you be able to do, say, an Auckland to Wellington or Invercargill to Christchurch or whatever, and fall asleep in a vehicle? Do you think we could have the technology that could do that safer than a human driver, and B, would it be legal?
Okay, I think if I'm looking 10 years out, I wouldn't be looking long distance. I'd be looking in the cities. I'd say that the cities, that you'd have a certain area, like a CBD type area, and ordinary vehicles, individual vehicles would be outside that perimeter, and inside is where you'd have the autonomous cars, so that you'd have almost like a network. So you drive to the perimeter, and then while you're in those urban areas, because that takes care of all sorts of things. It takes care of that sustainability argument. It's better for the environment. It's a way of dealing with traffic congestion, that kind of thing. I don't think it would be efficient to have an autonomous car that would take you from Auckland to Wellington. There's other ways of tackling long haul travel outside of autonomous cars.
Yeah, I guess that's an example rather than that's necessarily the need.
I would like to see. I mean, I kind of see that whole. When you look at the electric scooters, micro-mobility, I almost see that as a start.
Yes.
And it would involve a massive, I mean, it's not just about the tech here, it's about the willingness of local councils and city councils and people and ratepayers to understand the infrastructure. We've got to stop building car parks, for goodness sake, and we've got to start thinking about how we can create car-less environment, which might be filled with some kind of
that's
autonomous
pretty much happening
vehicle.
now. You found that trying to come to the studio today because, our part of the city has been disrupted.
Yeah.
Our 2-lane street has been converted to, basically a one-way.
Yep.
And we've got a cycleway filling up the other half of it. So we're very much on that journey. Now, whether we're too early or too late and so on, there's all sorts of debate.
But you've got to make it seamless. You've got to make it really easy. You've got to make it easy to jump out of your car and jump on and know that you can get where you need to go at the right time. So I personally would like to see it as an urban solution rather than a long-distance solution. Do I think it's going to happen in 10 years? Oh, it's a lot. It's going to be hard to get people out of their cars.
What do you think, Bill, on the autonomous front? Can the tech deliver? Could it deliver safely in 10 years?
I think there needs to be a level of breakthrough which we're not seeing yet for that to happen. Is the first thing. The second thing is that you could have asked the question 10 years ago, and if you drew a straight line projection 10 years ago, you'd have said, yeah, sure, in 2021 we'll be doing it, because what it looked like 10 years ago was that we were on that trajectory, and you know what, the trajectory has soared and it's flattened out, it's plateaued, and development in autonomous cars has plateaued. A lot of the investment money has gone out of that sector because the VCs, who, we're back to the tech investment model, they're not seeing their return on their money fast enough. So, and I think
Uber stepped out of that, didn't they? They sold off their autonomous driving.
And I think that's the clue that they don't think we're going to be doing that in 10 years' time. Right. So, but that doesn't mean we won't. It means that these things evolve in ways that they're not smooth curves, they're not straight lines, they're step changes. And I know that's a tech industry cliche to talk about step changes, but we need probably 2 or 3 step changes to get to that point. And they can happen tomorrow, or they might happen in 9 years' time, or they might happen in 25 years' time. We just don't know.
Yeah.
So the thing is it sounds like I'm saying I don't. The answer is I don't know. But
none of us do know. No, we don't. No.
Do you know what I would really like to see between Auckland and Wellington is a hyperloop? If we think about Elon Musk,
well, that would be a lot of money.
Yeah, that would be a huge amount, but kind of interesting.
Yes,
or even like a European style TGV train would be good.
And look, on this topic, I think you probably both know where I sit as a person who's invested. I don't know if that's the right word for buying a car. I've purchased a Tesla so that I can get a feel for where the technology is at, because that's really the only way to sort of test a semi-autonomous technology. And I mean, I use the whatever you want to call it, driver assist technology or what have you, every day wherever I'm driving. But it is a number of steps away. Using Bill's sort of terminology in terms of when I would have a confidence, or for the technology actually be able to do it, to do a drive like that. Now, interestingly enough, the out of the city part works very, very well. And I remember when I first tried out Tesla's Tesla on the motorway using their sort of tech, probably a month or two before my Model 3 arrived, and I remember being on the motorway between Hamilton and Auckland, and it's on the motorway where it's reasonably easy, and it can take you from an on-ramp to off-ramp with varying changes and lane changes and all these sorts of things, and where I feel that it's safest. If you were to fall asleep in a vehicle in New Zealand on the motorway, that's often something where people don't come out of it too well.
What about on State Highway 3?
Well, we've got varying roads, but what I found in that Hamilton to Auckland run was there was a whole lot of roadworks, and there were these sort of cones marking out, go this way, go that way.
Ducking and ducking. Were you sitting in the back seat, Paul?
And it just handled it. It does still want you to put your hands on the wheel, Sarah.
So you weren't sitting in the back.
But 10 years, if there was some equation to work out when Elon Musk says that's 3 months away, that's 6, that's 12 months away, and then a multiplier to that, a rule that we could use. But unfortunately, it's not consistent. So if Elon says it's a month away, it could be 6 or 12. If he says it's a year away, you just don't know. That said, the current beta versions that they've got in the US do an incredibly good job of driving around a city.
Yep.
And
Kansas,
getting you from your home to your office, and giving way to other traffic and figuring out stop signs and traffic lights. And even one I saw, there was a police person who was directing traffic, and the car managed to sort of navigate that. Now that was maybe more luck than anything else, but anyway, I'm fascinated to see how that will evolve, and then what that actually ends up meaning for society if people that maybe haven't been able to get around very easily in the past can then do so for very, very small amounts of money, which we've seen Uber facilitate transport for people who in the past maybe would have never caught a taxi, but an Uber journey with the technology has helped bring those costs down.
I think the way it'll work out is one day we'll wake up and it's here, right? And it'll be like that too.
Like electric scooters.
Yeah. I mean, we did. We woke up one day and suddenly there were electric scooters.
They were. Yeah, that's true. It did happen quite fast, but it hasn't kind of moved on from where it was 2 years ago when it entered the country. So I guess that in a way the promise of autonomous cars and the electric cars and the sustainability argument works really well in an urban setting. But to your point, I mean, if it's easier to go in a straight line on a motorway, makes sense. But I think you've got to have self-driving cars that most people who are driving now would want to be in. And as soon as there's an accident, as soon as there's a fatality or whatever, it feels like everything gets pulled back another 6 months.
Now, two more topics that I really want to sort of delve into. One is really associated with globalization and the really big, I'm going to call them tech companies just to wind you up, Bill, the really big tech companies that may not necessarily be tech companies, and quantum computing. So, Bill, you've got some opinions on quantum computing. Most of us have very little knowledge of quantum computing. It's more a buzzword that gets thrown around. For those sort of watching closely, there's been a lot of development going on and a lot of effort from the Googles and Microsofts, varying universities, IBM. There's actually some impressive stuff going on behind the scenes here, but it's a really complex space, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is the killer is that suddenly, and we're talking, and when I say suddenly, I mean in the last 2 years, but it is sudden because the idea of quantum computers has been around 40 years, right? And it was first mooted 40 years ago, but in the last 2 years, suddenly there's a huge amount of venture capital gone into developing quantum computers, and there's also some of the biggest names in tech are involved, like Google. I mean, IBM's had a long project in there, and there are some companies that sort of are from the past, like Honeywell, which most of us have forgotten about. They're big in quantum computing. The thing about quantum computing is that it's not the same as, I mean, to say it's not the same as everyday computing is trite, but it's not even on a par. It's highly specialized. The applications of the technology are very highly specialized. It's brilliant if you want to investigate, say, molecules, or you want to plan how to build a new drug, design a new drug or something. It can do that sort of thing quite well. It's reasonably good at some other tasks, but there's a lot of things that it's just not designed to do at all. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's not really reliable yet. There's not enough reliability in the machines that have been shown so far, and it's possible there are some theoretical physicists who say that that's inherent, that it's not going to be reliable, that you're going to have to accept that there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty, which is an interesting word to use when we're talking about quantum.
It's interesting to mention reliability because, earlier on in the week, in fact, this will be released, but these episodes a few days apart. But in episode 527, we were delving into the ENIAC and these early computers, and of course, they had major challenges with reliability because bits would be failing every single day.
Yeah, but here's and it's incredible that you should mention that, because when I was thinking about this driving in, I was thinking the third thing I was going to say about quantum computers is when you program a digital computer, right? We've all got a bit of an idea about how that works, right? When you program a quantum computer, it's a bit like ENIAC, where people have to walk around the back of the machine and twist dials and move sliders and tighten things up and so on. In other words, setting up a problem on a quantum computer it's not like entering a few lines of code. There's more to it than that. So they're quite complex to use, and it's the knowledge needed to get anything out of them is highly specialized too. So I think the thing is that they hold a huge amount of promise, but we're not there yet.
They're still in theoretical land.
Yeah. And once again, it's the sort of thing that there could be a breakthrough any day which changes that. Right. It's possible.
Now we need to move on because we're not going to do a 2-hour episode today. And look, we're trying to cover a lot of ground. We're trying to talk about the future, and there are just so many different aspects. But one area that really, I guess, has held my attention and really got me thinking a lot over this last 10 years with the New Zealand Tech Podcast. Is what's happening on a global basis. These big organisations, and we've seen the rise of the likes of Facebook and the varying other sort of social media platforms, Snapchat, Twitter, now Clubhouse. We've got Google just completely in such a dominant position in terms of in their role from a search perspective, the Google News portion, their involvement in I guess a range of areas, but a lot of that heavily focused on search, but the other areas that they're in, Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, these big global players. And there are probably two things that I'm keen to hear thoughts on. One is around regulation, and we've just started to see a bit more going on in terms of regulating these players. Australia, have put this pressure onto Google, who reacted very strongly a few weeks ago, and then came to the party and said, yes, we'll comply with the regulations and we'll pay for the news content that we feature. Facebook have probably maybe emulated Google's initial response in some ways, rather than saying we're going to pull out of the market completely, which is what Google said for a day or two, a few days. Facebook have basically just blocked all news content. So they're very much, I personally think, taking what looks like a very arrogant approach. I might be, wrong about their why they've decided to do that, because it is debated in terms of how good is this, how good is the law, and is it actually balanced and fair, and is it actually going to work? So there's that sort of side, the regulatory side. And then the other aspect is this whole globalization and ability for instance, a company like Amazon to move into a market. And to be fair, with Amazon, we haven't yet seen a complete sort of mega dominance in any other market, other than the US, from what I can see. But they've got such deep pockets and they've been so successful. You can imagine if they decided, look, we want to own e-commerce, supermarkets, etc. in New Zealand, they could afford to sort of walk in and stomp on local entities through acquisition, through doing their own things and just pouring in lots of money. So there's these two aspects, and I think potentially regulation needs to come into both. What are your thoughts, Sarah?
Well, I think just on the Amazon thing, I think that was the fear in Australia 2 years ago when they came into the Australian market and didn't really come through, because it's just very, very difficult to build out a commerce an e-commerce type experience that is local and can deliver in a day and all the rest of it.
But surely that comes down to how much they're willing to invest. So if they were serious about...
But it's been incremental.
Yeah, I mean, it's been slow and incremental, hasn't it?
It has. It hasn't been the big fear to the local players. Where
Amazon, would it be in a decade, though?
Well, I think that and that's interesting, because why would you come into the New Zealand market anyway? They're not in a rush, and that's building supermarkets and building fulfillment stores is a better way of saying it. So you can fulfill e-commerce and your plan within a few hours is really quite a difficult and expensive operation. Where they're dominant is AWS, is Amazon Web Services. I mean, that's the really interesting play from Amazon in this part of the market. And at the moment, according to IDC figures, we're only about half. We're like quite a slow market to adopt public cloud compared to other countries, and we know that Amazon's is just about half of public cloud in terms of the market, and then but Microsoft's the number 2, and then Google very small number 3. So you have to see that as really where their dominance is lying, and they're coming in and they're sort of competing with local players on that world, the datacoms, those sorts of people. So yes, that is one side of things. Regulation is actually really interesting, because how do you regulate these multinationals and
whether they're
countries?
Social media, whether they're content providers like Netflix or e-commerce.
And we know that, in terms of it respecting local laws around, even name suppression and courts and things like that, it's much harder to regulate that when you've got international players in your market. However, I think the Australian law, which is basically this idea that Google and Facebook need to compensate news companies for people linking to their sites, is a very troublesome and difficult law, because it's basically and it's very black and white situation, is it's basically favouring one traditional business model over another. Now, Google and Facebook are quite different. I mean, obviously Google's caved to a certain extent. It said, okay, we will work for you. We had that big threat 2 or 3 weeks ago. They haven't come through. They probably played a better game in terms of PR, whereas Facebook's today's just ripped it out. Yesterday just said, no, we're not going to let you link. It's causing all sorts of issues. They didn't even get it sorted. They've actually blocked government websites. But having said that,
which could be part of their play.
It's a different, although they've said publicly that was a mistake. They just didn't get it right. I mean, I imagine it was a bit of a blunt instrument. But in the law is just being debated now. I think that the issue there is that Facebook's different, because people voluntarily put links in there. They're not linking as a matter of course to these newspapers unless the news sites they have some sort of mechanism through which they can. If they're so concerned about being on Facebook, why don't they just ask to be removed? Instead, they can see, and Facebook would say, that the newspapers, the news organisations have been benefiting from what Facebook has been, the traffic they've been sending. The newspapers, on the other hand, are saying you're benefiting from the free content we're giving you. I think that, and what will happen if this law comes through and Facebook, if they cave into it, is that the money will go to the news organisations. Now, the biggest issue in terms of finance with multinationals in your country is they don't pay the tax. That money should be going for the people of Australia in compensation for the money that they're taking out of them. And I think that's where these big companies need to really start, is that we need to see more movement on making sure that they pay their fair share of tax.
Yep, I hear that, and there's possibly even an angle to say, well, this is the way they do it, actually, by putting other mechanisms in place that will bring some money back into the country. Now, we have to finish up, but Bill, I want to give you the last word on this before we close.
I want to say one thing about Facebook and then talk about this subject more generally, if that's okay.
2 minutes.
Sorry?
2 minutes.
Okay, with Facebook, right, it's a bad law. And Facebook is a bad company, but actually Facebook is right. It is breaking the internet. And I hate to be Facebook's defender here, because there's so much wrong with that organisation. But in this case, they're right.
I agree.
Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that the way Facebook reacted is a very worrying sign about these big tech companies, is they're starting to throw their weight around with sovereign governments, and that's not a good sign. And if Facebook does it, Amazon can do it, and Google can do it, and Netflix, they can all do this sort of thing where they throw their weight around and they start saying, stuff you, we're going to do it our way. You just don't matter anymore.
Well, in many cases, they're worth more than a lot of countries'
and
economies.
They're more powerful, and we should never have allowed governments in every country should never have allowed that level of dominance and monopolistic behaviour. And there's a long history of antitrust and and pro-competition policy, and it just hasn't worked with these companies. And part of that is because America, and it is America, has been blind to that for about the last 25 years for purely ideological reasons. And now we're in a position where these companies are getting out of their tree and starting to throw their weight around.
But the American government, there have been moves to and I agree, that's where it's got to stay. But there's also alliances that can be done, and company, remember Ireland always giving Apple a free run. You've got to stop stuff like that, which the European Union.
The European Union is a possible counter, and we haven't. And I'm just going to say one last thing before we wrap up. Right, we've had all that discussion without mentioning China. Right.
Oh, and that's a whole other
that's
episode.
A whole episode.
And I think there's going to be a lot more topics that sort of we've probably touched on today, haven't had time to squeeze into the agenda. And what we will do with the New Zealand Tech Podcast going forward is we're going to do more of these sorts of sessions, more panel type discussions on different subjects, different parts of the economy, different areas of tech. Anyone wants to share sort of feedback on where you would like to see the show go, then get in touch. We are on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and we have a survey form up on nztechpodcast.com/survey. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Sarah Putt, Bill Bennett.
Thanks, Paul.
Really appreciate having you on these 3 episodes, and we'll catch you again on another episode very soon. Thank you.
Kia ora.
New Zealand Tech Podcast, the voice of the tech community, proudly supported by Umbrella Connect.